In the early 1800s, the state of Georgia-owned Western and Atlantic Railroad hired engineer-immigrant Edward Vincent to design a passenger train depot for Atlanta, which resulted in the city's well-known Union Depot, or as locals referred to it, the car shed. After designing Union Depot, Edward Vincent opened up an office in Atlanta, and the city hired him to create an official map. This map, the Vincent Map of 1853, is Atlanta's oldest existing map. As we have referenced in past stories, the 1853 city limits were determined by drawing a circle 1 mile out in every direction from the 0 milepost, which was the terminus or the endpoint for the Western and Atlantic Railroad line. To get you oriented, this is the Western and Atlantic Railroad line. It ran from Atlanta north to a place called Ross's Landing on the Tennessee River. Ross's Landing would become the city of Chattanooga. And this is the point where the W&A's chief engineer fixed the 0 milepost. And on that spot, they built the Union Depot, which served as the junction point for Atlanta's 3 railroad lines. Of course, as railroad technology improved, train traffic would grow exponentially. In a short 25 years, Georgia had more rail lines than any other state in the Deep South, and Atlanta had become a major rail transportation center, which was a good thing. Unfortunately, it also created a problem that plagued the city well into the 20th century. With all of those train tracks crossing through the heart of the city, Atlantans were finding it difficult to safely cross from one side of town to the other. Vincent's map illustrates the problem. 3 major rail lines entered the city and converged at one central point. The bulk of Atlanta's population lived and worked around that central point, and one can clearly see from this map the disruption the train tracks caused. At any given time, any Atlanta street running roughly north and south was likely to be interrupted by moving railroad cars, making it extremely difficult for pedestrians and horse and mule traffic to navigate across the city, with one exception. You'll note on Vincent's map that this street is the only one in the city that isn't intersected by rail lines. That is because in 1852, the city built the only bridge in the heart of Atlanta that crossed the railroad tracks. A more dimensional representation of the city's roads and its one bridge can be seen in this 1870s bird's eye map. To get you oriented, this is Union Station, site of the 0 mile marker and the point where Atlanta's 3 rail lines intersected. Moving along the tracks, you can see the relationship of Atlanta's roads to those tracks. This 1875 photograph of Atlanta graphically illustrates the challenge faced by those wishing to get from one side of the city to the other. This is a photograph of Atlanta's commercial center, and you can imagine, with all the trains moving about, what it must have been like to navigate the road that runs across the center of this picture. Many of the early photographs of Union Depot were taken from this perspective. George Bernard, the photographer who traveled with Sherman's army and is responsible for most of Atlanta's earliest photographs, took this picture in 1864. On closer inspection, it looks like wooden planks had been laid down to help make crossing the tracks easier, but probably not much safer. A clue as to why this particular perspective of Union Depot was so popular can be found on the bird's eye map. It seems logical that the photographers were standing on the only bridge in downtown Atlanta that crossed the railroad tracks, which offered an elevated view of the tracks as they ran under the bridge. The gentleman in this photograph has his back to the Union Depot, and the bridge he is facing is the Market Street Bridge, so named because the city had established Atlanta's first central market at the end of the bridge. Market Street would eventually be renamed Broad Street, probably because of how wide the road was compared to other streets in the area. You can get an idea of that width from this picture of the bridge, the second or third Market Street Bridge, depending upon your source of information. It was 70 feet wide, more than twice the width of the original bridge. The Market Street Bridge would remain the only bridge across the railroad tracks in Atlanta until the turn of the 20th century, and it would not be until the end of the 1920s that Atlanta would complete its system of bridges or viaducts, making for the first time in its history crossing from one side of the city to the other a much safer proposition. This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories of Atlanta.